From the Baker Institute for Public Policy at Rice University in Houston, Texas, this is Baker Briefing. I'm Ed Emmett, Baker Institute Fellow and host for this briefing. On February 16th, the Alabama Supreme Court issued a landmark ruling saying that frozen embryos can be considered children under state law. Today we're talking about what the Alabama ruling could mean for the rest of the country, and for the science of human embryo research, and what are the implications for reproductive health in America. I'm delighted to have two of my colleagues here with me today. Kirstin R.W. Matthews is a Science and Technology Fellow at the Baker Institute, and McClain Sampson is a Fellow in Maternal and Reproductive Health. Thanks to both of you for being here. We're going to try and analyze Alabama's landmark ruling from two important angles: the ethical issues around human embryo research and development, and the potential impacts this ruling could have on reproductive health in the United States. But we can't ignore the fact that while we have scientific experts and technical experts, a lot of this is driven by politics. And after the court ruling, we're already seeing policymakers, I'll use the term, sort of dive for cover a little bit and go, oh my goodness, this does take us into a realm where we didn't really think it would ever go. So let's start with a fundamental question. Let me ask a basic question that really hovers over the entire abortion debate. Has any society in history conferred human status on fetuses, much less embryos? Before you answer, let me say, to do so seems to open the door to all kinds of other policy issues, ranging from tax breaks. I mean, you get tax breaks for children. Are you going to get tax breaks for fetuses and embryos in the future? To child abuse. If a woman miscarries, is she possibly going to be hauled before a grand jury on child abuse if you're now defining the fetus and even the embryo? And even to the census. We count all humans who are in the country at the time of the census. So are we now going to somehow go into the private family matters and ask who's pregnant and who has how many embryos on storage? I mean, where does it end? So your brief thoughts on that, please. And Kirstin, I guess we'll start with you.
So I'm not a historian, I'm a scientist. So going back into history to figure out whether or not we have or have not actually looked at this specifically. But that also tells you that it would entitle us having to have a historical perspective and going back to a time maybe more when women were thought of just as incubators. Like our entire role in life was to have children. We had no role outside of the household. And that's, I think, what we're talking about. A lot of people confuse what happens. There's so little knowledge of early human development. We don't know a lot about it as scientists, but I think as society, we don't know a lot as well. When we talk about these IVF, we're talking about a ball of cells, either 2 cells to, I think when they get to the point they're injected in the woman, it's around 64 cells of only 2 cell types. One's the placenta, which is the barrier for the baby, and the rest is what's going to end up being the baby itself. And it's within 2 weeks before it really gets implanted into the woman fully, and it starts to grow. About half of them actually die spontaneously. It's just nature. It's no one's fault. It's not the mom's fault. It's not a clinic's fault. It's anyone walking around trying to get pregnant will know. It doesn't happen perfectly the first time. So these are really complex issues, and it hasn't been focused for a long time looking at fertilization as kind of the point that we would define life beginning. That's kind of a philosophical one that we really haven't dealt with, especially since IVF started. I think a lot of people just kind of punted that because they wanted to have this kind of miracle clinical therapy to help with people who were having problems conceive.
Okay, so McClain, same thing, your thoughts on that basic question, but after that, then kind of start by laying out what do we need to know about the Alabama High Court ruling?
Well, yes, when you ask the question about has any other society conferred this status to fetus, embryo, from what I can tell, the answer is no, no other society. But we do have a trend going on in this country, and it's called the personhood argument. And that's what we're seeing here, and I think that's why you might be observing people jumping to react right now, is because we are in fact heading into uncharted territory. To start conferring personhood status to frozen embryos, which is what the court ruling did, really brings up all these other questions that you brought up. And in fact, Georgia has already started defining personhood as starting at the moment of fertilization. And they do have it on the books that, yes, you will get tax credits for the fetus. It's after 6 weeks. And you can be subject to issues of child abuse. And, you know, my training is in social work, and I'm well aware of how big that issue becomes when we start talking about child abuse occurring in the womb. With things like IVF, you have to undergo hormones, you have to undergo genetic testing, let's say, things that could affect the embryos. Are we going to be holding women liable for criminal charges if something happens to the embryo or the fetus? It's really concerning, and it's not well thought out, is what we're about to experience.
So you mentioned the women involved. What about the clinics? Are they vulnerable to prosecution?
Absolutely. I mean, when the ruling happened, they did say that frozen embryos can now be considered children, and parents are able to go after prosecution. They're able to press criminal charges if embryonic stem cells are destroyed. So 3 clinics in Alabama, the 3 biggest ones, I believe, did immediately cease and desist their operations for fear of criminal charges. So families who have invested thousands of dollars and undergone all of the physical hardness, you know, the physical, I don't even know the word, but, you know, there's a lot that you have to go through to even get to the point of being able to do implantation. They're thinking now that all those things are just halted. They don't even know what they're going to do. Kirstin was pointing out that they can't send the embryos across state lines right now, so clinics have immediately stopped.
Physical, it's emotional, it's financial. I mean, these are all the things that these poor women are dealing with when they thought they were going to have a procedure and be able to potentially have children, and now are being told they can't at all. Their only other option is to go to another state and start all over, which is hundreds of thousands of dollars it could be.
Okay, so Kirstin, you're a scientist. Unfortunately, a lot of these decisions are being made by people who have absolutely no scientific background at all. But help us non-scientists understand some of the legal questions surrounding the human embryo research. You've touched on some of them. And are you surprised that this made it all the way to the Alabama Supreme Court?
Unfortunately, I wasn't surprised. After the Dobbs decision, I was really worried that people were neglecting to think about what was going to happen in the space of in vitro fertilization. So since IVF, which we first had in 1978, we have carved out a space to do research in IVF, a little bit of embryo research, and, for instance, embryonic stem cell research using leftover IVF happens in this little space of the first 14 days. It was chosen for lots of philosophical reasons, which I can get into if you'd like, but it was a good space that philosophers and scientists and policymakers could agree on. This is where we can actually do it. But this entire ruling puts it all into question, because if it's an actual person, you can't put it to research. You can't donate a person for research without their consent. Parent consent, that would just be abuse because the embryos don't survive the process. There's just so much in this space that we really have never talked about, because IVF doesn't get regulated at a federal level, because it just gets complicated when you think about trying to decide this actual thing, which when does life begin? How do we treat these embryos as special? And what can we do with them, and what's permissible and what's not? But I do want to take a step back and remind everyone that there's a specific perspective that life begins at fertilization, and that is a specific subset of the pro-life group. Not all of the pro-life actually ascribe to that. When we did work on embryonic stem cell research, we had lots of advocates within the pro-life movement that were fine with IVF. They were Christian conservatives. They were fine with donating leftover IVF embryos for research purposes if the parents choose to. So, and there's also other perspectives besides the Christian perspectives in our plural society. Jewish and Muslim faiths do not see the embryo until later stages, around 40 days, as having ensoulment. So at this point in time where it's a cluster of cells, they view it as a cluster of cells, and then ensoulment happens when it starts embedding itself more fully within the woman and growing more fully. So we always kind of have this dichotomy of like, this has to be the Christian perspective, and is that life begins. And I think that's unfortunately just a small subset of the Christian faith.
Well, for either one of you, it remains to be seen how far-reaching. This is one state. What do you see happening in other states? And the fact that this ruling came from a state Supreme Court, can it be challenged in federal court? What are the legal ramifications here?
I was reading that it's very unlikely that it will be challenged at the federal level because it's been decided at the state level. And we've already made the decision as a country that abortion rights exist at the state level. So we've kind of backed ourselves into this corner. And I'm very concerned that I've noticed that a lot of Americans tend to be like, well, that's just in that state. That won't happen here. But I would caution people against that thinking because, again, this trend towards the personhood movement is a much bigger issue and it is gaining traction. And essentially, when we start assigning personhood to the fetus, the embryo, it's a trade-off to the woman's health. So we're putting clinicians and families in these really precarious ethical dilemmas where they have to make decisions about what's going to get the more special treatment, what's inside the mother or the mother's physical and mental health. And you know, mental health issues are one of the leading drivers of maternal mortality and morbidity. And I will take this moment to remind the audience that the U.S. has the highest maternal mortality rate and maternal morbidity rate of all industrialized countries. We have a huge amount of maternity care deserts. We have a big problem with access to quality care. So we're already existing in a society that is not valuing women's health during pregnancy and postpartum. And now we're increasing restrictions on another way that families can either start a family or expand their family, and it's just going to create more confusion and more barriers. And I am concerned that it's going to catch on in other states.
McClain, with all those comments, you tiptoed right back up to that line about the political landscape that we're dealing with. It seems that anybody who's watched the abortion debate over the years comes to the conclusion that science tends to be pushed aside for the pure politics of it. So what are the most important trends? You touched on some, but everybody wants to know what's going to happen next.
Yeah, I appreciated the opportunity to do this podcast because I, like probably a lot of women, really don't want to think about this issue because it's very scary to me to think of restricted information, restricted access for myself, for my daughter, for all the women that we work with in the community. But the trends that I'm seeing are not only the trend towards personhood, but also an increasing trend of criminalization that's very concerning to me. You talked about when we're going to consider fetus and embryo persons that are entitled to their own rights, they have the rights of children, then again, the mother is kind of seen as a host body that is responsible for keeping a very safe and healthy environment inside of her. Some things are outside of our control. Also, we know that many elements of our environment are affecting the pregnancy. Like I just said, mental health, the more stress that we expect mothers and postpartum mothers to go through, the harder that is on her recovery, and it affects the actual birth outcomes. I notice a trend of increased barriers to quality care, increased misinformation, increase of policies that are worsening inequality. We have a huge issue of inequity in birth outcomes that I foresee only getting worse here because the less access you have to quality care and to correct information, the more at risk you are of a miscarriage, of preterm labor, of all of these outcomes that we're seeing that already exist without as many restrictions. And my biggest concern is that there's no consideration here of mental health. There's no consideration of what it does to a birthing person and that person's family to be denied the opportunity to expand their family if they want to, or to make a different choice for their family if they want to. These do create real mental health challenges that are going unattended because, again, we have a huge gap between people with mental health issues and the number of people that are actually getting seen for mental health issues. So a lot of untreated mental health in the perinatal period.
Kirstin, kind of the same question to you. What are the trends? What are we going to see?
Yeah, I completely agree with what McClain has described here. I think what we're seeing, it's a lot more complicated because they're looking at this issue from an individual, but they're actually forgetting the person behind it. There were about 400,000 cycles of IVF in the United States in 2021, and about 97,000 births resulting from that. There is a population of individuals who have gone through and are a result of an IVF process. I would also point to, I personally know many people who've gone, maybe they all tell me because they know what I do, but I think our audience, most of them have experienced a friend, a family member who's gone through IVF. And it's really disappointing when we have people's lives being changed by somebody who doesn't seem to really understand the consequences of the actions they're doing. They're thinking specifically of life beginning at fertilization, specifically of holding a clinic accountable for embryos that were destroyed accidentally or on purpose. I'm not sure about the details of the court case, but they're only looking at that one particular aspect of it when making these larger decisions, not really understanding how it's going to impact the everyday person.
Okay, I'm going to throw a little bit of a curveball here at the end. Over the years, going all the way back to Roe v. Wade and now the later decisions, science seems to be pushed aside. It's become an emotional, political decision. And, we see billboards and everybody saying, oh, yes, it's a human life. And I personally have known a lot of politicians who said things, but I knew they didn't really believe them. They just didn't think we'd ever get to this point. And now you are beginning to see, as I said earlier, policymakers on both sides kind of scrambling, going, oh, we didn't intend for this to happen. What is it going to take to get science, and I'll throw in common sense, back into this debate?
Ultimately, I think politicians, their end game is always getting reelected, and so it's ensuring that the public actually discusses and talks about these things. And I would ask the audience if they feel passionate about this and they want to make sure that where they are, IVF doesn't come under this kind of critique or level of restriction, that they talk with all of their representatives, both at the local and the state level, their mayor, their state legislators, their state senators, their U.S. senators, their U.S. representatives, heck, right to the president, right to who you want to be president, if the upcoming election, right to both parties, right, and tell them your voice and show up and tell them that this matters. Because if all they hear is the people saying we should have personhood at fertilization, they're just going to assume, one, that that's the major voice, and two, that those are the only ones voting. So we need to show by talking with our legislators that this is an important issue to us.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. Women are 50% of the population, but you would not know that when you look at political outcomes with women's reproductive health care. Where are women represented, or birthing people, to expand that definition? I think a lot of this is disguised as protecting pregnancy, but if we really wanted to protect pregnancy, we would not have only 50% of access with birthing hospitals. In the state of Texas, we only have 50% availability for birthing hospitals and birth clinics. So we have a major problem.
What does that mean exactly?
It means that there are not enough maternity care facilities, hospitals, or birthing care. So you've got people who don't live anywhere near a hospital, who maybe live 2 hours away, and so that puts them at major risk. So when we say that we care about pregnancy, our actions are not matching that we actually care about the pregnancy, because pregnancy starts very early, right? More women would be having prenatal care. In Texas, only about 70% have prenatal care, and usually from what I see in the programs I work with lower income populations on Medicaid, they're not getting in until second trimester. So if we really want to have women's health care represented, women need to be speaking up. They need to really be encouraged that what you say at the local political level really matters. Commissioners, reach out to your commissioners, to your city council. We have done a good job of increasing female representation in politics, and I think that we need to increase representation of this issue and add a human component think we really need to start talking about how the persons are affected by this.
Kirstin and McClain, thank you very much for being here today. This is a conversation that could go on in this setting for a long time, and will probably go on in a public setting for quite a while. And if there's a good that comes out of this, to end on a bit of a positive note, maybe this ruling is really going to get people engaged a little bit more.
Yeah, wake them up.
To start listening to science and common sense. So thank you both for being here today.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Baker Briefing is brought to you by the Baker Institute for Public Policy, which provides meaningful, nonpartisan policy analysis on the most critical challenges facing Texas, the United States, and the world. Baker Briefing is produced by Victoria Jupp, Shannon Moriarty, and Karina Zimmel. AV production is led by Kevin Young. Our interns are Rice University students Riley Barker, Gray Beaubien, and Maria Morcus. If you like what you hear, leave us a review or visit us at bakerinstitute.org. Thanks for listening.